Once again, guys, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Manny Fragilis. We're really happy to have John Gotch for this live session. So as you guys know, we're going to be talking a little bit about Marvelous Designer. And speaking of Marvelous Designer, we'd like to thank them for being a sponsor for this session. And also want to let everybody know that Marvelous Designer 5.5 is going to be released on April 15th. So definitely make sure to check that out. Amazing features. They have tons of features that they're going to be rolling out. So so definitely make sure to check that out. Also, as most of you guys might know, John is going to be doing a masterclass with us covering Marvelous Designer. So definitely feel free to check that out. That should be a part of the links that was a part of the webinar when you signed up. But if you didn't get a chance to see that, we'll send out another one to everybody at the end of the session. All right. So basically, the way it's going to work, when you guys sign up for the session, there was a survey that kind of took you, that asked a few different questions, or asked you a few different questions in terms of what you would like John to cover. And so what we've done is we compiled that together, and I'm going to be feeding those to John throughout this session. If there's any additional questions as well, definitely feel free to throw it up, and we'll try to get to them, before the session is over. Obviously, John is, taking time from work. He's taking his lunch break to entertain us for the next hour or so. So obviously, we're not going to be able to cover all of your questions, but I'm going to do my best to go through it. And without that, I guess without further ado, I'd like to, have John take it away.
Hey guys, I'm John Gotch. You could just call me Gotch. Basically, I have over 10 years of experience in the game industry. I worked at studios like EA Mythic, which basically worked on Dark Age of Camelot and Warhammer Online. Both MMOs, great products, but they're way old now. I recently went to Tryon after that, and that's where I worked on Defiance. Tryon also made Rift, but I wasn't a part of that team, but Defiance was really cool. And then Molten Games, which was a really cool stylized game, got to work in Unreal and everything, but that studio didn't work out well. So then that's when I was fortunate enough to get a job at Kojima. So Kojima is basically what introduced me a lot to Marvelous. I used Marvelous beforehand. I used it for several years, but when I started at Kojima is when I really got hands into it, and I really enjoyed it. A lot of the talented character artists there helped me to get into it. I learned a lot on my own, but the other artists there were very helpful, so I learned a lot from them too. But after doing it for a couple of years, I left Kojima and I went to Shadow Rock, and now I'm working on Evolve and then an unannounced project. So Marvelous is being used very lightly right now, but I still use it at home for personal projects and everything else. So overall, that's pretty much my experience. The game industry has its ups and downs, but yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Sweet.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll just kick it off with what's on everybody's mind, which is just taking us through your workflow, for Marvelous Designer at Kojima Productions when you worked on Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah, definitely. So at Kojima, a lot of the stuff I learned from Kojima Japan. They had a lot of their files on the network, so you could actually check out their stuff if you worked at the studio. So I learned a lot through that. So basically, you would start off with, if you have an avatar or the whatever character you're working on, you get the concept, whatever, and you would just basically build the cloth first, or depending what it was. If it was all hard surface, you just do hard surface. But since this is basically all about Marvelous, if you get a concept with all cloth, you just pull it into Marvelous after you get your avatar. So you build the basic cloth up. You start very simple with the cloth. You don't add too much detail to start off with. You just want to get the overall form of it. Don't worry about wrinkles. Don't worry about anything besides just getting it on the avatar and just having the seams where they should be and just have it look like normal clothing. So it's not too tight or anything. After you get to that point, that's when we get to put the details in. Then you could import in other stuff like the metal bits or little pouches and stuff that I wouldn't do completely in Marvelous, but I do a lot of it in Maya beforehand. So basically, if I look at like this, I did this was all done in Marvelous, but like the lower body, like the darker areas of the cloth I previously made it in Maya just to get the form out. Then I UV'd it, unwrapped it to know exactly how to make it in Marvelous, because it basically lays it out like a 2D pattern. So after I get in there, I could make it in Marvelous, put it around the character, and that was my reference guide. I remodeled all of this for the final product because it was really tight and it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do in Marvelous, but the cloth was what my idea was to. The cloth was what I wanted to get done for Marvelous. So after I had all that, you get the folds where you want. If some folds you don't like going forward, you could always just redo it and reproject it over in ZBrush afterwards. But I would take it about 50–60%. This is pretty much about 50–60% I would take in Marvelous, and then I would import into ZBrush and do the rest of it in there. Add the little details, add the seams, add the little buttons, and everything else in ZBrush. After that would just be then the retopologize, UVing, and then getting it in the engine. So that's pretty much the basic workflow. This outfit probably took me a little bit longer, but if I had to do it from scratch now, it probably would take me 2 to 3 days. In a game setting, game work line, you really want to hit the deadline, so you can't just play around in Marvelous to get the wrinkles exactly how you want. So you just have to keep pushing forward. If it's not coming out exactly how you want, you just got to go forward. So you could finish it up in ZBrush, but most of the folds come out realistically and really nice and Marvelous. So it's a great start. So either way, even if you can't get it to 50%, if you can get like 30%, you can still finish up in ZBrush. But as I'm getting a lot more skilled with it and understanding it better, I could probably get it to like 70–80%. So yeah. That's pretty much the workflow. They also had tension maps and blending normal maps for different characters. So for Metal Gear Solid 5, the like Snake, his hand had 3 tension maps, basically an open hand, a closed hand, and then a medium spot. So they would blend between the 3. Metal Gear Online, we didn't get to do the blending normal maps; it was just too expensive for the previous gen consoles. But yeah,
Cool, great. So I guess we'll just continue with a couple other questions. How far do you push your Marvelous assets before bringing them into ZBrush?
So yeah, when I first started in Marvelous, I would pretty much take it for about 20 to 30% because we have deadlines at work. If I'm at home, I would try to push it as far as I can. But nowadays, I would take it at least 70% in Marvelous. It's just a time constraint, deadlines in the game industry. You just can't waste time. So it all depends how far you could make it. And as long as you set a deadline for yourself, you just have to make it work. So for me now, yeah, it's like about between 60 and 80% I'll take it, depending on the timeline and deadline stuff. So
okay. Are you guys using Marvelous to produce cloth wrinkle maps as well?
At Metal Gear, at Kojima, Metal Gear Online didn't, but Metal Gear Solid 5 did. Because it was single player, so they had a lot more leeway. I can't talk about it at Turtle Rock right now, but for Evolve, I didn't do the wrinkle maps yet.
Okay, cool. How do you handle collars in Marvelous?
Collars, yeah, they're a little tricky because you have a little problem. There's some problems with them, but you could do a few thing. I'll be going over it in my class too. But like a lot of the stuff for collars, I use where you strengthen the mesh because it gets the fold where you want. And let me just find the avatar. So for collars, basically, Marvelous 5 added an awesome function. So when you build a collar, I would build it pretty much straight out. And it would be like this. So when you simulate it, it just kind of flops down. But if you strengthen it, it'll get really tight. But then they have this awesome option up here, which is pretty much fold arrangement, where you could click an internal line, and you could rotate on the line itself. So you could just rotate it on that option. So when you simulate, it'll come back down, and then you could unstrengthen afterwards, and it'll lay a little bit nice, but you have to do some more work to it. But yeah, the collar is pretty much just a straight cut with fold rendering off, so it's not getting a hard edge in there. Cool. But yeah, that was just a very quick collar.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So did you import base poses to create blending normal maps for wrinkles?
You import base poses. So if we're doing blending normal maps, you would animate it in Maya beforehand, and then you would export it from Maya as like a, I think it's like a vertex animation sequence. So you could set keyframes, so you'll have like the knee bent, knee folded, knee straight, and you would import that animation into Marvelous, and you could just render it out. And as you pause it, you could export those 3 different sections out. Then you would do the transfer of the normal map over to the UV set or whatever you had to do. So
Okay.
yeah,
Well,
there's a lot of different techniques.
That question.
What was that?
No, I think that answered that question.
Okay.
What is the best way to export an OBJ from Marvelous Designer?
I personally like to just select all the mesh, and then I go to File, Export OBJ Selected. And when you export OBJ Selected, you'll have the option box, and it all depends on what you want to do. But for me, in Marvelous, I like to view with thickness on, but when I export, I always export with thin because I want to handle the thickness in ZBrush afterwards when we retopologize, when I re-Z remesh it. The scale, depending what you import it as, you got to make sure you export it correctly, the opposite of whatever you import. So if you import it in at 1,000%, you want to export it at 10%. Okay. But then all the axis, depending what is your engine handling, if it's Y up, Z up, or whatever, and that. So it's pretty straightforward for how you want to export. But if you export it like this, if you just go File, Export, it'll export the avatar out with it. So that's why I usually select what I want to export and export selected.
Cool. All right. So how do you determine cloth resolution?
So in Marvelous, I'll usually work. So when you import anything into Marvelous, you want to start off with their basic avatar. And when you import in your own avatar, I always import added as, just so you could get a good reference of it, of scale. Marvelous is really strict on the scale of everything, so you want to make sure it matches approximately the starting mesh. Yeah, what was I saying? Oh, and then the cloth resolution. So if you have the cloth drawn, it always starts off particle distance 20. You could change that in this startup options. I usually use between 12 and 15 on average, and then after I get everything done, laying everything on, I'll usually bump that down between 2 and 5. The lower the number is, the more dense it is. So if you look at the mesh right now at say 50, it's not that dense, but if you change it to like 5, I probably shouldn't change it to 5, it's really dense. So it just all depends on what your computer can handle, really.
No, that makes complete sense. And I guess that's the case for a lot of softwares in general.
Yeah, pretty much. You just have to, whatever your computer can handle.
Yeah, exactly. But what do you, I mean, what is a good resolution in terms of getting the quality that you want? I mean, that's probably also based on the material as well, right?
It all depends on the material you're using, and also how much work you want to clean up in ZBrush. Because when you Z-remesh it, it's going to smooth out some of those details, just because when you Z-remesh, you'll have the polish option on, or you're going to get some errors. So when I use Z-remesh, it usually polishes it out. And I will still do cleanup work afterwards, so it's not like a big deal. So it's really a preference. But yeah, I usually get it down where my computer could handle it before I import into ZBrush, because ZBrush could handle it, but Marvelous, when you go so low, it chugs when it's simulating all that, since ZBrush doesn't have to simulate.
Yeah. So do you retopo solely in ZBrush?
I used to retopologize just in ZBrush, but now I'm using Quadra and Maya. I still want to use TopoGun, but Quadra is working just efficiently. My ZBrush, they changed some features, and it's crashing a little bit more for me. But overall, I still prefer ZBrush, but I have some problems with it at the moment. But Quadra is actually really efficient. Okay.
What is your rule of thumb for what's sculpted versus modeled when working with assets in MD?
So a lot of the stuff I would do in Marvelous is pretty much all the cloth. So I want to get the big read, the big folds basically for Marvelous. And then any of the metal bits or like the hard leather you could still do in Marvelous, but depending on the timeline and deadline, how much time I have to mess with Marvelous until I have to go ZBrush. So if I really want to focus on the stuff Marvelous is great at, so basically all the cloth, If I have time after that, then I'll go to the stuff the secondary stuff like hard leather or smaller gear. But if I'm running out of time, I just have to go into ZBrush. If it's a personal project, I'll do as much as I can in Marvelous.
Okay. How would you go about doing shoulder pads?
So it's a little vague of a question depending on the shoulder pads. If it's like a armor kind of shoulder pad, it would just be hard surface modeling. But if it's like a cloth leather shoulder pad, I'll still probably model out a base mesh and put the cloth over it. That's something where you can't find a cloth pattern online. So what I would normally do is model out the basic idea of it. I'll UV it, flatten it, because the UV view pretty much is like a cloth pattern. So I'll see how it is, and then I'll just mimic it in Marvelous, and then I'll wrap it around the mesh. And then I'll adjust it afterwards to make it the wrinkles how I want.
Okay, so I have another question here. How do you give inflated thickness to thicker clothing like leather jacket?
So anything in...
you have something you could show us?
Well, yeah, the thickness is basically open garment. What do I have? I don't know which file this is. This was just a personal project. So in Marvelous, you have the thickness view and the thin view. If you just put the thickness view on, you could select whatever mesh you want. And when you have the thickness collision and thickness rendering, you change the thickness here. So for like this hoodie, I put it at 7.5. The collision will be where it actually pushes off the mesh, and the rendering will be what you see. So if I change it, if I wanted like a really thin thing, I could change it to 1. So it's very thin on here. But for a hoodie, I made it 7.5. They also have a cool option here. It's in the new Marvelous 5, where instead of having this hard edge around here, you could also just soften it. But it'll render a little bit. Also, the thickness for me is just for Marvelous. When I export, I never export thickness just because I'll do it in ZBrush afterwards, because I could add subdivisions in ZBrush when I add my own thickness. And it's chugging pretty hard after I check that. But yeah, the thickness is just for viewing. When you mess with the different fabrics is when you get the different materials basically to look on it. So yeah, that's
great. So do you use arrangement points frequently, or do you find they are not necessary?
The arrangement points, I use a lot of the options, so it all depends. I pretty much use all the options. So I try to use as little as I can, but to get as much detail as I want, you have to use a lot of the options. The arrangement points are great. I didn't use them from at Kojima, but if I make them, I'll make 1 or 2 of them just for like headbands or belts. But overall, yeah, I have different hacks to get my stuff around the mesh if I need to. The arrangement points are helpful. It only take a couple minutes to set up, but that's a personal preference.
How do you keep cloth from intersecting with overlapping armor?
Depending on, that I'd have to actually see exactly what you're meaning, but if the armor is overlapping on something, I'll always do the cloth before I import in any mesh on top of it. So if the cloth is sitting underneath metal, I would just do the cloth first. After I get the cloth how I want it, then I'll import the mesh in afterwards. And I'll adjust the mesh so it's not clipping crazily into it, but I'll still tweak it around to get it. So there's a little bit hacks here and there to do different things, but yeah, it's you have to make it work because Marvelous isn't designed strictly for games, so you have to make it work for what you're doing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, so moving along, how do you achieve pockets and internal structures with clothing?
So a lot of the stuff I'm going to go over in my class with the pockets. They have a lot of cool features. Like this thing I made last year or a year and a half ago. I just use internal lines just to get the basic outline. But nowadays, I would cut this out. I'd make another pocket, so I'd actually make it like an actual pocket. I would sew another pocket in, which I think I have from my class, one of my demos. The pants, right? This pants, I have this pocket is basically sewed in underneath. So it is actually underneath. So I'll go over it through my class. So I wouldn't, when I first start off the pants, I wouldn't have a pocket here. I would cut it out afterwards, and as I cut it out, it adds it in. So yeah, I'm not going to get into it all now because that's going to be that's a long demonstration.
Nope, not a problem.
Yeah.
So I have another question here. How would you approach something complex like a layered wedding dress, for example?
A layered wedding dress. Well, you just start it as simple as you can. As you build it out, so there's different techniques. You could freeze the mesh as you're building it out, or some other options are you build the base, the inner dress part, export out as an avatar, and then build the next cloth on top of it, and export that out, build the next piece on top. So as you export each piece out, you'll have it layering on top. Then at the very end, you could import it all as a cloth and then simulate it. You could change the layers, since Marvelous changed the layer system, but you still have the layer system. So when you import it all in at the end, you could change the underneath one would be layer 0, the next one would be 1, 2, and then you simulate, and it would all go on top of each other. You'll get some errors, but you just have to make it work. You would import it one at a time. You wouldn't do it all at once and hit simulate, because it would definitely cause problems. You'd import the first one and second one, and then simulate, then then you could freeze it, import the third, simulate, then unfreeze, simulate. So there's a lot of different techniques just to make it work.
Great. So, all right, we already answered the shoulder pad question. We already went over pockets. Do you make boots in Marvelous?
I didn't make any boots in Marvelous yet. It depends if it has a lot of leather, but most of the boots and stuff I'll just model out. If it has leather, I would model the boot first and then put the cloth on it and just wrap it around. But all the boots and shoes I do for game development is pretty much modeled beforehand.
Okay. So I have another question here. Let me just reword this. Oh, so this guy's asking, do you ever find yourself in a situation where you think that it's faster to just do the cloth, just sculpt it, versus doing it in Marvelous Designer? I think you kind of answered that earlier, but
yeah, at my experience now, it's probably about the same amount of time. Sometimes I could do it a little faster in ZBrush. Sometimes I could do it faster in Marvelous. But overall, the overall quality comes out better in Marvelous if you're aiming for realism. If you're sculpting it, you could sculpt it really realistic, but it still gets that sculpt look, which sometimes you want. But overall, if you do it in Marvelous, the simulation is going to look really nice. You're going to get the folds how you want. There's a lot of leeway and a lot of playing around to get the folds where you want them for game development. But overall, yeah, for me right now, it's about 50-50, the same time.
Okay. And what would you say would be the advantage of, one or the other?
Yeah, Marvelous overall, just that you get the folds to look realistic. You'll get everything to look right. ZBrush, if you're comfortable in ZBrush, you're just more comfortable in ZBrush. Plus, in our industry, you just have to learn new tools, new programs just to keep on top of everything. So any tool helps. So even if you're just using Marvelous for basic pants and shirt, not even putting pockets or anything on just to get the folds, it'll probably help your workflow. You don't have to model it out. You just have the cloth in there, and you can put it in ZBrush, and then you could just touch up, add the pockets, and everything else you want. In my experience, when I first started in Marvelous, I really was just using it for basic folds, basic stuff. I wouldn't go into detail with all of it. I would just do the rest in ZBrush.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is Marvelous open to Python or some other coding language to automate repetitive processes?
Yeah, I don't know about the scripting or any of that. From what I know, I don't do scripting, so I don't even know if it's in Marvelous, but I didn't even try.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So we're actually doing really good on time. John is kind of plowing through most of these pretty quickly, so this is great.
Yeah, I talk a little fast.
Yeah.
My bad.
No, it's all good. It's all good. So, are there any good references or resources for learning how to create appropriate clothing patterns?
So a lot of the reference I use, pretty much Google Images. You'll search up and you'll find a lot of stuff. Where is it? Like if I just do quick searches on Google, like stuff I found was, Where is it? I don't know where. All right, I don't know where I saved out my images now. But a lot of stuff I would just Google search for cloth reference, cloth fold patterns and stuff like that. I look at shirts that I own, look at jeans I own, or even in the store. A lot of the websites, if you just go to, like I use Pinterest a lot, so I have a Marvelous board. I also have an outfits board, so a lot of my reference, I would just go here and I could just see different kind of clothing patterns and stuff. I try to hit it as close as I can sometimes, but obviously you don't want for copyright issues. But a lot of the patterns after using Marvelous now, it's kind of like you're UVing it pretty much, so you just understand how to split it up. You just want to flatten it, but you want to put the seams basically where they would be comfortable on the character and everything like that. So there's a lot of sites I use. I also have like reference for clothing. So I have a few websites where it'll just have different clothing sites. So I just could look at stuff, some weirder ones, which are just really more different kind of outfits. But yeah, I just have a lot of just overall just clothing sites. You could just Google image a lot of it, but a lot of it you just learn on your own too.
There's just trial and error, I would imagine, as well, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of trial and error.
Cool. How do you go about wrapping the straps around a character?
You could either do it with the arrangement points, or depending on how you do it. Sometimes I would just I don't have an avatar in here. New preference avatar. Yeah, if you don't have arrangement points, she has arrangement points on her already. But if I wasn't going to use arrangement points on my own thing, come on, select it. I would just hack it on. So I would just put it on the character really quickly. I would just put pinpoints in it, and then I could just manually just slowly pull it around the character if I could select it. And as I pull it around, I could turn off the avatar now though. And then I would just pull it around the character, and then after I pull it around the character, then I could just weld it in, and then I could just delete all the pins, and then it would just go around the character. And after it's on the character, then you could worry about the placement of it. So yeah, there's different ways. The arrangement points obviously is the quickest way. If you have arrangement points on there, you could just select it, select on, and then yeah, you could change the settings on where it actually goes, how tight it goes. So after it wraps around, you can just move it on and you can just do it. The arrangement points makes it a lot easier, but there's different ways to do it depending on your time frame. So. Manny?
I'm here.
Okay.
Are you done?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. Can you import vector paths as clothing patterns?
I never did. I don't know if you could. The only way I import do patterns in here is if I add like another cloth in here, but I won't use it for anything. And then I'll put an image on this. So I don't think I have an image right now. And I'll just import an image on here, and then I'll just move this backward. I'll change the layer order to send it back. So anything I put on top of this, I could model around the outline. So this would, the underneath one would have my image plane on it, basically. That's how I would do it. I never did with vectors, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is Marvelous capable of triangulating or quantifying assets?
Yeah, they added that I think in the later version of Marvelous 4. You could quadrangulate it in Marvelous, but for me, I just do it in ZBrush afterwards. You could do it in Marvelous, so if you have delete all avatars. If you do the garment, and then if I open up just something, you could just select on the mesh, and you could just go to where's quadrangulate. So let me just put on the wireframe really quick, and then if you click it, and then you could go quad and then it'll just make it into quads. Zero mesh will give it a little bit cleaner mesh and everything, but overall, this is pretty nice.
Is it calculating or?
No, it already did it. It's
Okay.
quad instead of tri. So if I undo,
Cool.
You'll see it there.
Okay. Great. Answers
Yeah.
that question. So do you create arrangement points on a custom model? I think we already answered that.
Yeah.
Just going through some of these questions because there's a lot of repeat of the same questions, so I'm just filtering through. Can you move and scale the avatar on the 2D pattern side?
Let me open up an avatar. You mean the little shadow gray box of the model? It is based on pretty much your avatar. So I never did that. You have the properties, but you could turn it off and on, I know. You could turn off the grid and stuff like that, but I don't think you can change the scale because it's basically giving you a reference of what your scale is. So if that's what you're meaning, if you want to change the scale, you would have to change your scale of your avatar.
Cool. How would you handle character cloth interaction, like a character putting on a hoodie?
Let me see. Preference. Open avatar. So this was another character for another demo from my class. Hoodie. So as you simulate, let me turn on the subdivision. So it's a little bit faster. You could just, if you model out, when I do a hoodie first, I would pretty much model it, sculpt it with it up, and then I would pull it down just to get the reference. But yeah, I would just, you just pull it over, model it out. And as you pen it up, it'll be a little bit easier. It's just a lot of playing, going back and forth with Marvelous to get it how you want.
That looks so easy, John.
Yeah, it has a lot of problems, but right now it's a little bit floaty. But yeah, I still have to mess with this a little bit better. But yeah, overall, yeah, you just play around with it. Marvelous is just fun to play.
Yeah, definitely.
But of course, with time deadlines and that, you kind of go a little bit faster. You don't worry about all the little minor things.
All right. So, did you have to do any actual measuring to get your patterns, such as military BDU?
I never did like when we worked at Kojima. They were very strict on some of the gapping on different kind of like the little straps on the characters, but I don't think they went into the detail of like it has to be 200 millimeters, well, 50 millimeters by 50 millimeters. But they were strict where there's like it has to be an inch and then an inch apart, or inch and 2 inches apart. So they were strict on that, but they weren't actually measuring out. They just want to make sure it was either the same distance or double distance at Kojima. But I use a lot of the measuring tools now for just getting like different thickness on stuff, just to understand the basic length of stuff. So my measuring tools are hidden. So if I want, like if I'm making a sleeve, I'll just do very quick where I just click and I'll just see, oh, this is 420 millimeters for the length of the arm. So if I'm making a sleeve, I want to make sure it's at least 420 long, but that would be very tight. So if it's like, this is 570, so it would be a more of a shirt that's hanging off. But yeah, for measuring stuff that precise for game development, I don't think I would do it that precise as of now. Kojima, they were a little bit more strict on stuff like that, but they weren't that precise. Yeah.
Cool. Can you import one garment into another? Anytime I've tried it, it will replace the garment already in the scene.
Oh yeah, yeah. You just go to File, Import, Add. Just don't go to Import. So if you import Add OBJ to garment. So if I wanted to open up my pants on this dude, if I open up the pants, And if I want to add in my shirt now, I don't know where I placed the other thing. If I import add obj to garment, it will class, not obj, import, you want to add, sorry, that was adding another obj. If you want to add another garment, you could go to file. Instead of opening garment, you go file, add, and then add the shirt. So then I would have both in here. And right now, since this is clipping into that, I would freeze the pants, and then I would simulate it again so the shirt comes over it. I think somebody had a question like that, and then you have no problem with this. So
cool. How dense of a mesh are your avatars on average?
I usually decimate the avatar different. This is a mesh from Nick. I can't pronounce his last name, but it's a free mesh he posted on his website. But if I'm working in the game industry, a lot of my avatars, I'll have them really low at first. They'll be like probably about 5,000 tries, and then as I want to get more detailed cloth in there, I'll have different meshes basically. So I have a 5,000 mesh, maybe a 12,000, maybe a 20,000, and pretty much I won't go too high. But if the mesh is too low, you're going to get as you up the poly density on your cloth, you're going to get those edges in the mesh if your mesh is too low. So you just have to have a nice balance and whatever your system could handle.
Cool. What point caching or animation export format is the best?
What was that?
It's he's asking what point caching or animation export format is the best.
If he's asking for what to get it into Marvelous, there's one tool that I use. I don't know exactly the name offhand. I don't think I have. Actually, let me check. They do like it was a tool I got for Maya. I don't know for Max offhand, but for Maya it was called MC2 MDDD2. It basically exports out the animation sequence as vertex animation. When you port it into Marvelous, you'll go into the animation tab and it'll have the animation sequence in here, and this is where you'll render out the different cloth. But I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah, I think that's what he's asking.
Yeah.
Are there any personal settings you have in Marvelous that you feel should be set by default? Or are there any staples you may have for general scene setup and workflow?
I go over it in my class, but the basic thing is when you start up Marvelous, usually it defaults to screen coordinate gizmo. I always change the locals. You could do world too, but when you selected this gizmo, it's basically talking about. That's the one feature I'll always pretty much change. Other features are just the overall graphic settings. I would change it to 2 anti-aliasing instead of 8 or 16. Sometimes I turn off show shadows so it renders a little quicker. But yeah, overall, there's not many settings I change. After working for so many years, I try to leave the default as close as I can, because if I jump on somebody else's machine to help them out, or if somebody jumps on mine, at least have the default settings. So if you're comfortable enough to jump on somebody else's machine, you could work around pretty much their user interface if the default settings are somewhat the same.
Cool.
Yeah.
Is there any way you could achieve sharp memory wrinkles like the ones behind the knees on an old pair of jeans, for example? Or do you just end up sculpting those in ZBrush?
It depends on the exact fold you're meaning. They have, if you had the internal lines, you could add fold rendering, and then you also have the option up here, which is pressing. So if you have like pleated pants on the side, you could press like this piece to this piece, so this will turn into like a nice, it's been ironed. But some of the details I'll just end up doing in ZBrush afterwards. If that's, I don't know if the crease is right behind the knees you mean.
Yeah, I think he was like, yeah, I think he was referring to if it's just right behind the knees.
Yeah, I don't know. You could do the pleating, and yeah, some of the wrinkles, yeah, you could do it in ZBrush afterwards. But a lot of those small details I do afterwards.
Cool. Do you have any tips to speed up the clothing creation process or workflow in Marvelous?
Keep it simple. As long as you keep it as simple as you can when you initially make it. So like these pants, when I first start the pants, files, if I first start the pants for work or something, they would be very simple. If I didn't have much time, this is pretty much what I would just pull into ZBrush. I didn't let it simulate it all the way, so they're a little bit messed up here. But I could just do this really quick, a very simple pattern if you need just to get stuff done very quickly. Just simple pants, and you could just make them, and then you could just do the detail afterwards. But yeah, as long as you don't add too many of the little vertex, the black dots, it'll keep it a lot easier. You just got to keep your workflow very simple to begin with. You don't get too overly complex and too crazy. Even when I made these pants, like I added a little tapering in at the end, but if I really was on a time constraint, I'd probably just do basic squares and just do the rest in ZBrush.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So I have a question from a concept artist. I primarily design costumes for film. Since I'm new to 3D, what programs would work best with Marvelous Designer? I'm using ZBrush at the moment. Would you also suggest learning Maya?
If you're a concept artist, I would just, ZBrush has pretty much every function you need at the moment for a concept artist in my mind. If you're pretty new to 3D, I would just stick in ZBrush. Marvelous is pretty simple, but it depending on your experience. ZBrush is a beast to get over the UI and everything, but after you get through all that, I think you could move on to learning Marvelous or Maya afterwards, but I don't think you need to. I think concept artists could stay in ZBrush and have enough potential to do what they need to do.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, because unless they're getting very ambitious and wanting to animate, the character or something like that, but I completely agree. Do you find yourself reusing, oh, you're going to say something, John?
No, go.
Yeah. Do you find yourself reusing patterns, or are you just starting fresh every time?
This pretty much goes back to even before I used Marvelous or ZBrush, I would always start with a new base mesh if I could. It all depends on time constraints. I like to start over because every time I start over, I learn something new. If you have time, or if you want to put in overtime at work to learn something new, I recommend always starting from scratch. Even if you get frustrated and it doesn't come out as good as your previous one that you could have started from, you could just delete after an hour or two and just use the old one. But for my reference and my experience, I always like to start from scratch because I learn something new every time.
Cool.
And it always gets better.
Yeah.
Almost always.
How do you deal with deep folds from Marvelous that need a reprojection in ZBrush?
It all depends. It's the deep folds. So I'm trying to exactly understand the question. If you're Z-remeshing it, it'll be fine. But if you're projecting it, you could split the mesh up into different sections and project it. I use a lot of morph targets and different ways to hack it together. There's just so many different ways you can do all this stuff. So yeah, it depends. If you really are having a hard time projecting it, it's probably not even worth time to project it. You probably could just sculpt those areas. If it's those deep folds, it's probably not even going to be noticeable in game enough that you're going to need that cut in there, that model, unless it's for animation reasons, for cutting in the pants. Like, yeah, if it's like behind the knee or that. But yeah, it comes on a case-by-case basis, so you have to see what it is exactly.
Cool. Are you welding seams when exporting from Marvelous, or do you sculpt them in ZBrush?
The seams are I assume just the seams, like the pan seams. When I export the mesh from Marvelous, I do weld it usually. Sometimes I don't. But if I'm in ZBrush afterwards, I'll weld it. And I'll still double and triple check to make sure they're welded correctly, because sometimes coming from Marvelous to ZBrush, you get little errors where they won't weld it third and you'll have a little gap. But yeah, the seams, if you could do it in either program. I sometimes pull it in Maya and do it in Maya afterwards if it has some problems. But yeah, you just got to make sure, just check the mesh. And worst case scenario, if you notice an error after you start sculpting on, you could remesh it, or you could reproject it over afterwards. So. Great.
How would you do ties or a tie belt? Do you have any tips on that?
So I did a lot of bandanas, and I have a lot of problems doing bandanas, tying the knot in the back. I have bandanas I've done, and they come out, but they never look as tight as they should. Because if you make it tighter, the mesh just folds in and on itself. Different ways you could do it is cutting the mesh up into different meshes so you could change the layering system. Ties wouldn't be too bad because you just model the tie and just put it on top, and you could change the layering system, then freeze it. Tied belts, doing any kind of knots, I have a little problem because as you tie the cloth in Marvelous, as you would tie it in real life, basically, you just use pinpoints, you just slowly tie it. But if you make it too tight, the cloth will just fold in on itself and just slide through. So that's always been my little trick, little problem in Marvelous. I would just do it in ZBrush afterwards to make it look tight.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, so the other question is, how do you combine hard surface models with cloth in Marvelous, similar to the best that you did for Metal Gear?
I think. So a lot of this stuff, the padding on top, I model out most of the geo underneath, and then I put the cloth on top. So like I was saying, I would model it out, UV it, see how the pattern looks, where I want my seam lines to go, and then I'll just remake it in Marvelous afterwards, and then I'll get the cloth where I want. So then I'll just add stuff in Marvelous afterwards as time goes on, depending where I'm at to add the stuff. But yeah, a lot of it I do in ZBrush, and a lot of it I do in Maya. It all depends on time constraints. When we have to hit deadlines, I can't waste time in Marvelous on doing some of that stuff. But yeah, a lot of this I just model it out in Maya first, and then I put the cloth on top.
Cool. All right, so can you export FDX animated sequences from Marvelous to Maya or Max?
I don't use Max enough to understand, but Maya, I only export animations and sequences from Maya to Marvelous. I never had to export the animation, the avatar animation from Marvelous to any other program. But the clothing pattern, I would export out different poses for game development. I don't need that whole animation sequence. So I just need basically, if I was doing the tension maps or the normal map blending, I would do like a knee bent, a knee straight, and I would just export the knee bent cloth and the knee straight, and then I'd import it in Maya afterwards or ZBrush, mesh it, and then project the normals over for both states.
Cool. How can you apply Marvelous to cinematics?
I never worked in cinematics, so I'm not sure because they do a lot of cloth simulation for that kind of stuff. So I'm more just straight game development. We do a lot of bone animation and stuff like that. So I'm not
asking. He was asking if the process is very similar.
I'm not sure exactly how the process is for cinematics. I'm more into games than cinematics, so I don't know that.
I would imagine for the most part, in terms of the workflow within Marvelous, it's about the same. I think once it comes to how it's incorporated into the production, that's probably where it differs. Because at DreamWorks, we started using Marvelous, and from talking to you and kind of going through this process, it's basically the same. Once the process of bringing that back into production as a viable asset, that will actually probably where it would depart or differ a bit.
Okay. Yeah,
so, Go ahead.
I wasn't sure exactly, just because I don't know if you want to have the wrinkles before you go into cinematics, so they already have some wrinkles in there, or if the simulation for cinematics are done in the rendering of it. So
yeah, and I would imagine it's each production is probably going to be slightly different.
Yeah.
Based on resources and what their budgets are.
Yeah, it's all about budgets and deadlines.
Exactly. Can you use some sort of mask to control the dynamic properties of the cloth? Like if a part of the cloth were to get wet and therefore act more damp?
You could split it off and set different fabric materials up for it. So if it's like wet, you probably put silk on, so it looks a little bit, feels that very light material, stickier material, and you could change different properties to make it tighter on the mesh, so the pressure is a little bit tighter. But they don't have stuff like that I know of as of now. So yeah. And if we're doing game development, you probably do two different models, one that the cloth is normal and then one that it would look wet, and then you could blend normal maps and stuff.
Cool. How do you add static meshes on simulated cloth, like a badge or a buckle?
You could just file import add obj as you model in Maya, that you could add import add obj, or you could add it as a garment if you want. If you model out something that you want as cloth and just as reference or something, you could add it as garment. But yeah, you could add any obj into the mesh on top of the avatar. The cloth will fight with it sometimes and it cause problems as long as the badge isn't intersecting into the avatar and the cloth isn't between it, it'll cause problems. But as long as there's a little gap and your cloth has some leeway to go, it'll work.
Cool. Do you ever use Marvelous's UVs?
Yeah, sometimes I would do. For like when I did a bandana or two, I would actually export out the UV map, and then because it has a perfect square, so when I go in ZBrush, I could have my texture of how I want to lay it out, so I know the direction of the folds and everything. But since I Z-remesh it and it's not going to be the complete thing, it's going to be a shell of the mesh, so it won't be exact. So I could still project some UVs over if I want specific patterns. It's a little more time consuming, but the quality will definitely be noticeable because you'll know it actually following the form of the cloth pattern. So it all depends on time and your quality at the time.
Cool. And how would you do more graphic stylized clothing that are more art directed to achieve a specific silhouette or a shape?
So if it's more stylized art, I would still probably do a lot of that in ZBrush. A lot of the stylized art is more you would sculpt it. You could set the fabric properties to be a little bit more thick, so you get at least a basic fold. But for stylized art, I would still do a lot of that in ZBrush, just because you could really say where you want your folds if you want to emphasize different angles, different silhouettes. Marvelous is more for realistic as of now.
Cool. In terms of just learning curve, how much ramp up time for sculpting artists to learn traditional techniques for pattern making, and just what's the overall ramp up time you think for getting up to speed with a software like Marvelous?
So like ZBrush, the ramp up time was pretty heavy because just getting over the overall UI of ZBrush is pretty hard. But once you get into it, you find to love it and you get into it. Marvelous, if you have 3D experience in the background, it's not going to be that difficult because it practically is a 3D view and a UV view. So you'll understand just making the cloth patterns are basically like laying out unwrapping your model. So the ramp up time isn't that hard. It's just getting over the UI and just figuring out how stuff functions and how it works, whatever works best for you. If I start off, you could start off pretty quickly and just get into it. And as long as you get the basics, like this pants, this is very basic. You could probably learn this within a couple hours. It probably wouldn't work as great as you want initially, but within a day or two, you feel comfortable enough where you could do this kind of stuff, I think.
Cool. And speaking of just talking about the class in general, how much direct interaction will the students have with you on a weekly basis? How often will we be providing feedback to their work?
So each week I'll give a video recording of all the feedback. I'll go through all the students individually and I'll go through all this, all their work and just give feedback, some little tips or hints if they needed it. And then the next day I would do a live Q&A with them. So if they have any questions, if they want any more feedback on specific stuff or had questions on my feedback to them, they could ask me then. So, and then I'm usually available and yeah, I'm open to answer questions whenever I have time.
Cool. And speaking of that, could you just give us an overview of what a student should expect from the class?
So the first week, I'm pretty much going through the UI. It's gonna be pretty intense. The first video, it's gonna be going through the UI. It's not gonna make exact sense, but you'll have that video to always go back as reference to know what tools are there, what tools are available. Because there's only a few tools I want everybody to use in the first week or two just to get accustomed to Marvelous, but I'm going through everything as I can in the first week just to get all that out of the way. So at least you have some reference to know that, oh yeah, this tool, or if you have to go back to it. But going forward, it's going to be very basic stuff in the first week. Second week is going to be pretty pretty easy too. Third week and fourth week is when I'm going to hopefully be able to get you guys to make full cloth for either female or male. And then the last week I'm going to go over hopefully introducing animation and just exporting different folds out for your cloth. It shouldn't be too bad. It should be a nice progressive learning curve, but as long as you can get the basics down, I think you'll benefit from the class no matter what. Just learning the overall, for me at least, learning the overall UI and understanding of the program is what gets me involved to learn a lot on my own afterwards. Yeah.
Cool. And do you think this class is more for beginners or someone that has some, experience with Marvelous prior to joining the class?
I still hope that it could be, it's definitely for beginners, but I would hope you have some 3D experience in the background just because it would help. Experience, if you're an advanced user in that, you might be able to get some information at the end depending what your experience in Marvelous is. I just learn stuff as I go, so I learn a lot from the Marvelous website. When they put out a new patch, they put up little short videos on the new tools they add, and then I learn a lot of that on there, and then I'll just do tests and demos to see how I could make it work in my pipeline, how it actually benefits me, speed up my schedule. So it depends how advanced the user is, if he's keeping up to date or not. And you might be able to learn a lot from me still. I don't know exactly what your experience is. When I try to learn a program, I try to learn as much as I can of it. So I understand most of the tools and different ways to cut stuff, but there's always stuff to learn at any point.
Definitely. And obviously with your class, you'd be going more to just from a production perspective, a standpoint more than anything else. So I think that's something that would benefit most people taking it.
Yeah, this is pretty much just all more geared toward game development. It's not geared for the fashion industry. So I'm not going to be precise with measurements. I'm not going as precise as they will have to go. We're not printing any of this or getting this made into real cloth patterns. You could if you want, but that's definitely not what I'm doing. This is for game development.
Yeah, definitely. So someone want to ask, and we're going to start ramping it down, guys, just because we're approaching that 1 hour mark. How did you create this theme on top of the KS helmet from some of the images from Metal Gear?
The seam on top of the helmet. It's probably in this one. These seams. So
yeah,
a lot of this was, so you'll see another pattern here. I think I put an extra thickness on, and this is an example when I probably did not weld it when I exported, so then I was able to slide it up in ZBrush afterwards and then add the thickness so it gets that seam. So it's actually a fabric on top of a fabric. I still welded it in though. In Marvelous, I still stitched it in, but in ZBrush afterwards I moved it up, so it's 2 different cloths in ZBrush afterwards. So there's different ways you could handle it. You could always just sculpt it in. It just depends on your comfortability and how you want to do stuff. So
cool. Could you please could you tell me if you use custom values with different materials, or are you just using some of the presets included in Marvelous?
Usually I use most of the presets, so you'll have different things you'll see there's A, there's D, there's R, and there's S. So it all depends what you're doing. S is for simulation, R is for realistic, and D is for, I forget, I think it's draft or something. It's basically default. It's a quicker simulations, and A is for animation. But yeah, I use most of these as default, but sometimes I have to actually change some of the settings. So if I want the stuff to be a little bit looser, I'll change it afterwards, but that's getting very technical. That's another thing with time. If I have time afterwards where I'm like, oh, the folds aren't looking right, I have some time to spare at the end of the day before I go into ZBrush the next day, I'll be like, oh, I'll play with some settings. But if I don't have that time, I don't have that time to waste.
Yeah. Cool. And this would be the last question, which is, how long does it take you to create a character in Marvelous?
So
and obviously, it's how long does it take you to create, a costume, like some of your work on Metal Gear, like one of your earlier work. How long does it take you to create something like that?
So this is when I wasn't as experienced in Marvelous. I used it for several years, but I'm using it a lot more. This probably took me about 5 days probably to make it Marvelous with everything, and I still probably went back and forth between ZBrush and Marvelous. But nowadays, yeah, I think I said I could probably make this in like 2 to 3 days, probably 2 days if I am on really tight deadlines. Then you have to make a female version if you have a female avatar. So it all depends. If this character probably took me a total of 1 month, so it probably was 20 days to do this character. But that's including, we also had to do the low poly mesh, set the materials. We had to do the skinning also in for Kojima. So that all that time frame is budgeted differently. So yeah, it's hard to give it an exact answer how long one character would take. I didn't have to do the base mesh though for this character, so that saved me some time. But I had to rig it still and skin it up. And that's at the time at Kojima we're using Softimage, which was not my software of choice.
Cool. So we still have a ton more questions, but unfortunately, we're at that time. So first, I'd like to start off by thanking John for just his thoroughness through the whole process. It's yeah, you obviously know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's just fun learning these tools. You have to know it to teach it. So
exactly, yeah. And it's and we answered a total of about 89 questions. So yeah, so obviously you know what you're talking about. So thank you so much, John, for your time.
Yeah, no worries.
It's like, and definitely, guys, it's like we sent a link. I sent you a link to the class. Definitely make sure to check it out. If you have any questions, you could shoot us an email. And also would like to thank Marvelous Designer for being a sponsor for this session. We're going to be doing more of these throughout the next few months or so. I can't mention any names, but we have a few amazing artists lined up to be doing these sessions to kind of provide you guys with more of an insight in terms of how different artists work, and also just a better understanding of just the industry overall. So once again, John, thank you so much. We'll let you get back to work.
Yeah.
And
awesome.
Everybody, thank you for taking the time. For those of you who are taking your lunch break, thank you so much for joining us, and everybody else, it's like, thanks again. So we'll see you guys in the next session, which is probably going to be next week sometime.
Cool.
All right.
All right, Derek.
Take care.
Later.
All right. Bye, John.
Bye.